They had their Tarins, and they were running to go back to the medicine camp. The night was clear, and morning promised to be a good one. But when they got back to the highway, Andreas stopped. "Focus, we can't leave. We gotta go help our other Tarins, the ones stuck in the tunnel." Chris reined Yeller up. Jesselyn now rode the wagon with Spencer and Redford, sitting at the edge of the loading platform. He smiled at her, then turned to Andreas. "There are 2 teams of them. 10 Tarins with high power. Surely they can handle it." Roland sidled his horse closer. "And yet they haven't. These Cody guys have figured out how to fight against Tarins. All it would take is some young, long-range arrows from high above, something plastic or wood, something you scarred-eyed sons of bitches can't detect. They'll be able to take out a few at least. After that, it'd be a waiting game. Waiting for you guys to get tired or burnt out bad enough to kill yourselves." Chris stared at Roland, and his friend continued with a gesture indicating all his marked companions. "What? That's what I'd do if I had to go up against a bunch of you." Chris smiled at Roland uneasily. His friend was tough. If he could figure out how to work their strengths against them, they would have their work cut out for them. He drew back, took his cowboy hat off, and scrubbed a hand through his sandy brown hair. "You are right. These Cody guys have fought against Tarins. Down at the horse trainer's place, remember? They know what we can do." Roland Riley shook his head. "They ain't dumb. And even though they haven't managed to take that spot, they sure as hell learned something. And didn't we send more Tarins down there?" Chris spread his hands, inviting him to come to his point. Roland shrugged. "All I'm saying is, the Tarins on the South Fork were sent there to do battle, whereas the ones from home came here wanting to talk, negotiate. I'd bet my bottom dollar that they weren't even thinking about opposition, let alone any sort of ambush." He scoffed. "I can't believe they let themselves be caught in the tunnel. I think you'd have to beat me like a $2 mule before I go into a tight spot like that, nowadays." He winked at the team of mules that were hooked to the little wagon and said over his shoulder, "No offense, guys. It's just an expression." Before putting his hat back on, Chris rubbed the itchy scars across his forehead. "I told the council it was a stupid plan." Roland tilted his head derisively. "Of course, oh great and gracious Fire Focus, you were right." Chris shot Roland a whatever look. Back at the jail, his friend had been told not to go in first, to wait until the Tarins had cleared the way, and he still had his panties in a twist about that. Then Spencer, one of the Tarins from the wagon's bed, sat up on an elbow to interject. Stifling a pained groan, he said, "Fire Focus, we heard about those 2 teams. What your buddy is saying is right. The Cody militia has those guys trapped good. You can't just run home. If you do, there won't be anyone else to help them." Chris put his black hat back on, screwing it down tight. The resonances of his companions swirled around him as he sat astride his mount, thinking. Under the brim of his hat, he studied their faces. They all thought he had the answers, just because Frey Ma Tuk had given him that stupid label. Focus. He was the Fire Focus of the Yellowstone Circle. His eyes fell on their spirit Tarin, sitting in the front of the little wagon and holding the lines to their mule team. "Jade, can you send a message to JT?" The expression she fixed on him was doubtful at best. "If I can get an image in edgewise, he's been bombing me with impressions of telling you to come home." He knew that. She told him that before. He reined the little Yeller closer, indicating the 2 maimed men behind her in the wagon's bed. "Did you show him our 2 guys here and the shape Ariel is in?" She nodded quietly, squeezing Ariel's hand protectively, and Chris went on. "Tell him they can't travel fast. It'll take us at least 5 days to get home. Then tell him it'll be 3 more days before he can come back and help." Jade shook her head, but her eyes were already glowing with their purple light. "I can't do numbers like that. Only pictures." But Ariel whispered then, her eyes still closed, her scars raised and pulsing, even though her Tarin twisted around the two young women with that sickly grayish-green tint. "We are sending in the picture of the number," Jade smiled, and the Tarin flows swirled around the two girls, combining for the added strength. In the back of his mind, he wondered if he could twine his strands together with another fire Tarin to get that added boost. But then he caught the edges of their communication with JT. The two girls started to giggle, and he perceived an image of himself resembling a balking mule. He rolled his eyes, but fixed his eyes on his two fire Tarins, Karsten and Damien. "I'm sending you back with the wagon. You will protect our guys and see them home safe." Indicating Ada, he added, "And you too. None of these guys know how to handle horses like you do. Get them to the camp as fast as you can." As he turned to Jesselyn to give her instructions, Roland rode up saying, "I'll go with him to help handle the horses." Chris was about to object, except that Ada bristled and spoke first. "God damn it, Roland! Stop hovering over me! I'm better than you with the horses, and if we're talking bows, I'm more accurate than you. You're not letting me do my thing, and you're taking all my points away. Back off!" When the two began bickering back and forth, Chris leaned down from the saddle to hold his hand out for Jesselyn. "You'll take care of Spence and Redford's injuries, won't you?" She rose to stand in the wagon, then pulled Chris close for a kiss. "Of course. You'll be back as fast as you can, right?" He breathed her scent close and said, "There are 4 boys at Bud's cabin. The others will tell you where that is. You guys better pick them little buggers up and take them back as well." Then he called Rusty to his side and fell in with the rest of his companions. Roland was still arguing with Ada, but Chris knew his friend would follow once Ada had made her point. As they loped and trotted through the soap brush, sage, and cottonwoods along one of the creek bottoms, he thought about the things just a few miles to the south. His home, his family, was only 50 or 60 miles from here. They could do that in 2 hard days' riding. They could find out if his mother had survived her injuries and how Tough was doing. They could help them rebuild, taking their new future into account. Chris was glad when Brandon guided them through a gate in the highway fence without a word. Right now, he really didn't feel like talking. Memories of his mother, of how he'd seen her the last time, beaten so badly she could barely talk, dragged at him. The sight of his father, so still and rigid, with 4 arrows sticking up from the stout chest, rocked through him. He was needed at home. Roland and Ada as well. They were all needed there. Loping beside Chris, Rusty looked up at him, one ear perked as if the dog was ready to turn away, to the south and towards home. The smaller pit bull, much too skinny for his build, ran behind Rusty, his tongue hanging out of his mouth as he struggled to keep up. Chris smiled at Rusty, who'd been his mother's dog for years. Only after that attack on their home place had he decided to follow Chris. Now, his companion settled back into keeping pace with the horses when he saw Chris's wait gesture. Then, as Brandon guided the group through another gate and onto a wide flat, Chris realized something else. They couldn't go home without the horses anyways. Trin would pitch a holy hissy fit if they showed up without Indy, and that gelding, as well as Skelton, was up at Bud's cabin still. Clory and Shaky had stayed at the Madison camp on account of their age. If they went home, they'd first have to go back there to retrieve their good mounts. They slowed their pace as they began climbing up a long, sage-covered slope. A few cedar trees clung to the alkaline soil, yet birds began to tweet their morning song even in this wild country. The sun was just tinging the sky purple behind them when Andreas and his cousin Colby sidled up beside Chris. Their horses' breaths came in deep yet even rhythms as they dropped to a walk, and the dogs were glad to match them. "So, Chris," Andreas began as he adjusted his McCarthy reins, "what are we going to do here? It might be nice to have a plan." Colby hid a grin as he lifted his foot out of the stirrup, then leaned down to tug at his saddle's latigo to tighten the cinch. Chris reached down to check his own cinch, and Yes, it had loosened, but not so much that he needed to do anything about it. He smiled at Colby and said, "What the heck are you laughing about? Don't you think it'd be nice to have some kind of plan?" Colby waved the concern away. "Don't mind me, I'm just being an asshole. It's just that back at home, when we were doing anything, Andres always wanted to be told 3 times what was going to happen." He grinned at his buddy and added, "We even gave him one of those little pocket notebooks and pencils so he could take notes." Andreas flipped his cousin off, but Chris said, "Aw, heck yeah. Little notes would have been nice. From the boss, not something you try to take. Most of the time you can't hear it but every third word over the wind blowing in your ears, and then they usually have a big wad of chew in their mouths, and even the ones you could hear you can't understand." Andreas made a "see" gesture. "A little map to let you know where the gates are, and where the trailer will meet you when it's done?" He laughed softly and added, "Without all that, you just go forward until someone screams at you from a ridge half a mile away. That's when you know you are in the wrong spot." Brandon slowed his horse, then pointed at their back trail. "Looks like Roland's going to catch up with us in a few minutes. Why don't we wait to discuss the details until he gets here?" They continued walking their horses up that long slope and called the other riders closer as Roland drew nearer. Brandon reached back in his saddlebag and took out a bundle of deer jerky sticks. Taking the t-shirt wrapping off, he tucked it away, saving it for later. "The way I hear it, there are about 500 or 600 of these Cody men. Hunters all. Bowmen and guys that know how to swing an axe. And the preppers, fighters." He handed each rider a thick link. "Don't get too cocky because you think you're invincible. They are tough men. Tough enough that they stopped your other bunch cold." Chris held up his hand and interjected, "I heard there were closer to 1,000. Brandon shook his head. "There are, but they're not all going to be here. There will be some in the town. And then they fought for and won all those irrigated fields halfway up to Powell and the ones on the South Fork. Some of their forces will still be guarding those places." He gestured to the south. "The canyon is just beyond that ridge. I'll take you west to the spot where you can see an overlook. We should be able to see where our guys are and how they're hemming them up." They continued on, up, until they reached a cedar forest just below the ridge. The dense woods hid their progress even from each other as they wound their way past the gnarled ancient trees. The birds that chirped loudly announced the coming morning even though the sun had not peaked over the eastern horizon yet. At this altitude, it was cold enough that the snow was still packed into the deep draws and even under the trees. Brandon stopped his bay and nodded at Chris. He zipped his heavy jacket closer against the chill as he gestured at a sharp drop-off to the south. "This is where we have to leave the horses and go on foot. I'll take you down to where I think at least one of their groups is. Maybe even 2. As the others began peppering Brandon with questions, Chris studied them. He hadn't even thought about having to go on foot for a while. Who could he leave behind to watch the horses? The normies were the obvious answer, but Colby was tightly bound to Andreas, the same way that Roland was always at Chris's side. Ada had been sent to take their injured men home, and Brandon, well, he was the only one who knew the trails down into the canyon. His gaze fell on Brady. While the native from somewhere up in Montana obviously had lost a lot of weight since his game console and the microwave no longer worked, he still had a hard time keeping up with all the others. Chris hated to leave him, though. The kid had shown himself not only skilled with his talent, but also strong. The next one he picked was Lisa, a short and curvy girl, cute by any standard, yet her stamina was not up to a tough trail down into the canyon. They dismounted quickly and head and tailed their horses together, while Brandon gave directions to a spring where they would find good grass and water. He explained again and again, while both of them asked question upon question, bewildered expressions on their faces. Checking his bow and arranging the arrows in his quiver, Roland grinned. "No phone, no GPS, no handy-dandy Siri to tell you turn right in a quarter mile." Tending to his own weapons, Andreas answered, "Yep, we're taking Brandon with us." Roland retorted, "I'll give you the directions we need. Go downhill. If you get to the highway, you've gone too far. I'm sure we could probably handle that." Yet when they approached the edge of the mountain and saw what lay before them, Chris's mind reeled. How had they ever climbed down that? The top of the mountain was edged with towering limestone cliffs, harsh and unforgiving. Cedar and pine trees covered a steep slope just below them, but then the side of the canyon became even steeper, and in the early morning darkness, it looked as though they were heading for the bottom of an abyss. He peered at the east, hoping for the sun to hurry up and show its face, just as Brandon said, "Come on, we gotta hustle if we want to surprise them while it's still dark." The former forest ranger led them along the top of the white cliffs at a fast jog. Holding his compound bow in one hand and steadying the long knife at his hip in the other, he suddenly turned toward the edge and jumped down. Chris held his breath, but the older man only dropped 5 or 6 feet and then let the momentum carry him down along a steep draw against the canyon's side. After a few yards, he stopped his half-tumbling run by clutching a branch of one of the old cedar trees. Pausing for breath, he studied his next drop, then continued. Roland grinned at Chris. "Dang, not bad for an old man." From the edge of the cliff, Andreas said, "Down that hill, Roland. If you get to the highway, you've gone too far." He pointedly ignored Roland's rude gesture and jumped after the older man. His descent resembled a quick-footed dance, full of grace and speed, and his Tarins shivered through the air. Every time his feet landed, they sank into the dry, hard desert dirt as if he were jumping into a foam cushion. With a silent prayer, Chris jumped after them and found the drop much higher than he'd thought. He landed with a jar, his arms milling wildly and his weapons banging against his legs. Struggling to slow down, he found his balance. Coming up against a large rock, he used it to stop and was immediately slammed into by Roland. Chris exhaled a sharp whoof with the impact, but then twisted around to find Rusty. The big dog had made it down the steep slope, jumping nimbly from boulder to boulder, and came to him with a wag of his tail. Stones and gravel had been dislodged by their careless footfalls and tumbled down the draw ahead of them. Chiari jumped then, giving a small whoop as her Tarin coursed through her. She seemed like one of those expert skiers gliding down their white slopes with practiced ease, weaving back and forth. She was in her element here, surrounded by rocks and earth, and her drop towards them was stunning to see. Colby came just behind her, then used a small cedar at the center of the draw to slow his own descent. Adjusting his footing, he stood and grinned as he continued ahead of Brandon even. "Show off," he muttered. J.R. and Floyd came down the hill then, bracing against something invisible. Only Floyd's motions and the elation on his expression indicated he was working his Tarin. Soft air cushions buffered the two men as they made their way down. Brandon led them down again, quick-stepping past Chiari, who whooped encouragingly. That brought the forest ranger up short. His shoulders heaved with his rapid breaths, and he pointed at her. "Quit your yelling, girl! If they made their camp where I think, then they could hear you." She winced at his words, but had trouble keeping the delight from her face. He indicated where the sun would rise in only a few minutes. "You Tarins get down to where it levels out a bit and then go west. There'll be a long, narrow plateau with some trees. They'll have their camp at the far end of it, by my guess, right where the trees get thicker. That spot will give them access to all 3 of the tunnels. There'll be an easy bow shot range there." Breathing hard, he fixed his eyes on the younger guys. "Roland and Colby, you can come with me. We'll stay high and watch the Tarins' backs from above." With a quick signal to Chris, he gestured to the 2 others and swiftly climbed up and out of the draw. Just before disappearing into the darkness, he stopped and looked to the east. "Don't dawdle now. The sun will be up in 10 minutes or so." J.R.'s eyes followed them as they hurried away, gave a thumbs up, and grinned wryly. "Yes, Daddy. Whatever you say, Daddy." They continued down that draw as fast as they could. Chris jumped when he couldn't run, slid when he couldn't jump, always using the sagebrush, grass, and scraggly cedars to halt his impossible momentum. And, just as Brandon had said, they came to a place where the ground leveled out, although only marginally. Following a line of low sandstone and lime cliffs, they headed west. The flat was only sparsely covered with cedars, while the sage was tall and gnarled, and the green spring grass under it was thick and fragrant. Taking a game trail, they ran beside a low cliff, and their whispered planning stopped when their hard breaths began to steal their words. Chris's firesight reached further than any of the others, and he soon found the bright yellow and white signatures of morning fires being lit. He stopped their progress and silently pointed ahead. This early in the morning, there was no wind, nothing to impede the archer's aim. As the first whiff of campfire smoke lazily drifted towards him, he hissed at Rusty, and when the big dog came, Killer followed in his wake. Chiari lightly thumped Chris's shoulder and pointed to the east. There, the sun was emerging over those far, white-topped mountains. He understood her implication immediately. If they engaged the men in that camp right now, the sun would be in the eyes of the others and at their own backs. JR closed on them, though, and whispered, "Wait, what are we doing? Are we really just going to go into this camp and mow the men down? Why don't we tell them to let our guys go? Why don't we just tell them to stand down?" Chris was about to answer, but Andreas spoke first. "What, you think they got 150 guys over there just to gather the cows off this mountain? Or maybe they're on a hunting trip, looking for antelope or bighorn sheep?" He hitched his weapons belt up. "JR, get a grip. They're here to kill the Tarins they've got hemmed up in that tunnel, and if they manage to get any of them alive, they'll cut off their hands, cripple them for the only purpose of taking their abilities away." Chris knew his eyes glowed with his inner power, not just because he was using it, but also because he struggled to contain his rage. He gestured northeast, where presumably, hopefully, Ada and Jesselyn were taking the crippled men home. What they did to Spencer and Redford, it's just wrong. Sick and wrong. Using his hand, he shaded his glowing eyes. All those guys over there knew about it, and nobody did anything. Andreas, his own eyes glowing in that terrifying grayish-white, said, "Yep, they played stupid games, and now we're going to hand out some stupid prizes. And the Tarins down there, people are going to learn that messing with us is a very bad idea." Chris thumped fists with Andreas, then they headed up the narrow plateau, letting their Tarins build inside them. He glanced to the east and saw the sun. It had just appeared over the mountains, changing the sky's colors from purple to orange in one breathtaking second. Rusty paced at his side, and Chris spoke to him, telling him to stay back. He hoped the pit bull would have enough sense to follow, but he had no way to warn the other dog about the danger ahead. A gust of wind, hard and straight, rose in the early morning stillness. It blew towards the camp, bending the scraggled sagebrush with its power. Floyd's hands gestured, and another gust funneled past them, to the west. They were closer now, and with his firesight, Chris could see the individual men. They rushed about, getting weapons, readying themselves. The natural wind, so strange and so strong in the early morning stillness, had warned them. Dirt, sand, and rocks erupted from the slope edge as Andreas and Chiari worked their talent. Whole bushes of sage came up with the explosions, and they were carried toward the campers as well. Andreas, Chiari, and Floyd marched forward, and Chris followed them. He would use his fire to protect and shield them, but then he had an idea. The next time Floyd's hands swept back to call on more wind, Chris threw his flames into the gale. Ahead of them, men cried out in fear, throwing themselves down to the ground as a wall of fire was funneled towards them. Sagebrush and old gnarled cedar trees erupted into surging flames. Andreas's dog, a sleek Aussie cross, rushed forward, but the rock Tarin called him back, not taking his eyes off the lines of dirt and rocks he threw into Floyd's air. Chris checked for Rusty, but the big dog was still behind him, carefully watching the destruction ahead. This was not the first time he'd had to stay out of the way until the fire quit flying. For a wonder, Killer still paced beside him. Floyd's wind gust had created a maelstrom that now fed on itself, and the Tarins themselves were no longer safe from it. They were buffeted by the winds, little bits of grit and sand pelting their clothes as they advanced against the other camp. Chris released his flares as long and as wide as he could make them, filling the entire area with searing heat that burnt arrows in mid-flight, whipping them up and away into the sky. Some of the Cody fighters managed to duck and roll clear of the flames, but there were many who could not escape them. They writhed and screamed as the fire caught hold of their clothes, their hair, even their bows and axe handles. At the back of the camp, someone shouted orders, and in the early morning sunlight, Chris saw a line of archers organize. Lifting their bows with precise coordination, they loosed their missiles at a shouted command. Chiari, her eyes lit up with that eerie gray glimmer and the scars over her face ridged and defined, exclaimed, "I got 'em!" She lifted her hands, but even though he could feel her pushing at the arrows, they had no chance of coming close. Floyd's turbulence fouled their path, and they fell down into the steep canyon beside them. Chris walked on, his pace matching Andreas and Floyd's. They advanced on the campers, and the maelstrom of wind continued to whip them. Gust after gust was sent against them, carrying rocks, debris, and flames. Eventually, the Cody men broke and scattered. That's when Chris heard the sounds of bowstrings coming from his right. A quick glance showed him Roland standing with his feet braced against a large boulder. He was loosing arrow after arrow into anyone coming towards them. More men screamed as they encountered Brandon and Colby, driving them back from the mountainside, back onto the flat. Chris looked back at Floyd. By watching where the air Terran sent his flows, Andreas and he could add their charges of rocks and flame. They pummeled any of the men trying to come at them, as well as those trying to escape. They walked forward, wreaking their destruction, when JR, the water Terran, cried out a warning. His water sight had detected several men hiding on one of the cliff's crevices. Shooting his hand out to the side, he gave a wild howl and advanced. A man shook his head violently, his arms trying to shelter himself, but then he dropped lifelessly to the ground. Keeping the gusts rocking and the flat filled with a wall of flames, Chris shot out his hand at another man keeping watch beside one of the limestone cliffs. Imitating the water Terran, he didn't use his laser-like stream, but only enough heat to fry the man's brain. As Floyd and Andreas advanced up the ancient ledge, Chiari pointed at one of the towering white cliffs, and with a huge rumble, it collapsed in on itself. The sound of terrified men could be heard as small boulders and rocks fell on them, then rolled across the ledge to smash those in their path. Rusty suddenly left his side and ran back, Killer and Andreas Ossie at his side. Several men came up from the canyon, well behind them, and climbed over the cliffs lining the plateau's edge. With a growl, the big dog sprang as the first man used a stout, gnarled sagebrush to pull himself up onto the flat. The man fell back with a cry, and they both tumbled back down the steep slope toward the bottom of the canyon. Chris could not spare a minute to worry about his companion. With one hand, he continued to sear the wind gusts Floyd sent across the flat, while his other hand used the laser beam he'd learned defending his family's cattle back at home. But he heard. The dogs, quicker and far more agile than any man could be on that difficult terrain, fought, growling and snarling, pulling down the men who came at them with heavy knives, axes, and machetes. Yet he could hear no whines or yelps. Maybe the mutts would be okay. He glanced at Andreas. The rock Terran was distracted by the worry for his dog as well. But Chiari stepped forward and began exploding more sections ahead of them, and Andreas settled back into the job. Chris shook his head and closed his ears. The dogs would have to fend for themselves. Leaving the flaming walls he'd sent into Floyd's gust, he used his laser beams to focus on a few men struggling to rush them. In quick succession, his laser beams sheared 3, then a 4th man in half. Then he spun when JR cried out another warning. Seeing several more men to the right, hiding in the cliff's folds, Chris concentrated all his fire on them. With surprised cries, they burnt to ash right where they stood. Then there was a shift. As the Tarins advanced up the narrow, sloping plateau, coughing sometimes as the wind gusts whipped dense smoke around them, they encountered no more resistance. Floyd whispered to the winds again, lifting them up and away. There, not 50 yards on, the Cody men fled, finding spots between the boulders to descend down the sparse, steep slope, sometimes sliding for long distances when the ground shifted under them. Chris strode to the edge, where the sagebrush ledge gave way to sandstone cliffs. With relief, he noticed that Andreas had gone back to check on the dogs. When he heard the sound of boulders and rocks striking the canyon's side, cracking loudly like hailstones on a windshield, he knew the rock Taran was using his power to help. Chris chased a few flaming streams after the fleeing Cody men, his control keeping the downward stream straight and true, strafing just above the sagebrush. The men jumped down the steep descent, angling to the west, and in the back of his mind he wondered why. They could have just gone straight down, to the highway, the safety of where their own people's arrows would shield them. Then he noticed the highway below him and the 3 tunnels. The middle one was directly below him, and he could not see its entrances. But the third one, the longest one, its entrance was almost completely covered with rubble. Half the mountain had been pulled down on it. And then there was the highway between. It had been completely obliterated. Boulders lay this way and that over it, and the asphalt had melted into impossible globs. Scorch marks were visible on the edges of the mountain, burnt cedars giving testimony to the strength of the fire Tarins who'd defended themselves here. On the other side of the canyon, in a cedar forest, he noticed men standing between the trees high above the river, arrows nocked to their bows and aimed up at him. It was a very long shot from there, though. Not exactly impossible, but not anything to worry about. Somebody truly proficient, might have the strength to launch an arrow so far, but nowadays, only very few had the accuracy to be truly dangerous at that distance. Then a projectile landed just below him, and he stepped back with a small curse. Its direction showed it had come from above the 3rd tunnel's entrance. Another group of men stood on a precipitous, broken ledge, balancing precariously on the unstable ground. Yet their arrows remained trained on him. He flipped them off, vigorously, but then heard a loud whoop behind him. Roland, Colby, and Brandon descended from the cliffs onto the narrow flat. Bouncing on their feet and cheering, they raced toward Floyd, who was kneeling between a couple of large sagebrushes. Chiari stood over him, murmuring softly, supporting his shoulder and checking his eyes. But Roland was oblivious to all that. "Woo-hoo! Yeah, baby!" He stopped and whacked Floyd's shoulders. "You rock, dude! That was friggin' epic!" Even though Chiari tried to calm them, first Roland, then Colby took her up in a big hug, twirled her around, and planted kisses on her cheeks. "Girl, what the hell? We knew you're badass, but this was a whole new level of epicness." Brandon joined them, laughing. "You should have seen it from where we were. Dirt and rocks on those huge winds, and the whole thing was filled with fire." He thumped Chris on the shoulders. "Fire flying straight across. It looked like we were in the movies." Andreas came up from the lower hills, the dogs in tow. Chris gave a relieved sigh. All 3 came back with him. Only Killer had a bleeding cut across his shoulder, but he didn't act like it bothered him. Instead, he followed Rusty, who loped easily across the flat. Chris sank down to his knees to envelop the big dog in a hug, taking care to run his hands over the thick black and white coat. When Killer approached to receive his share of the praise, Chris examined him as well. "Dang, Killer, that cut is deep. We'll have to stitch it." He stroked the skinny pit bull's back. "You'll have to wait till we get back up to the top, where the horses are. We don't have our supplies here." As Chris approached Floyd, Brandon called Roland and Colby to his side. "Get a grip and quit dancing around here like a bunch of cheerleaders." Indicating the men all around them, he said, "Check for injuries and get their weapons. We don't want one of them to come at us while we ain't watching." With a thankful gesture toward Brandon, Chris knelt by Floyd's side. Look at me, bro. Let me see your eyes. But the Wind Terran waved him away. I'm all right, man. I'm just tired. Give me a sec. Chris sat back and exchanged worried glances with Chiari. Then he remembered how Jade had drawn on his focus power to boost her strength. He called Rusty close and said, "Wrap your arms around the dog. I think he can give you a little bit of my focus strength." With a tired nod, Floyd did it, and Chris put both his hands on the Terran's shoulders. He had no idea what he was supposed to do. Just a few hours ago, Jade had taken what she needed without any explanation. Then, the Spirit Terran had been using her talent, and he'd felt what she was doing. Now, he couldn't tell if anything was happening at all. With a disappointed sigh, he began to rise. Well, it was worth a try. Yet Floyd grasped his hand. Don't move. It's not much, but you're helping. He pulled Rusty tighter with his other hand. After a few moments, Chiari knelt before them and checked the Wind Terran. I think he'll be okay. His eyes are getting steadier. Eventually, Floyd gave Rusty a pat on the back and straightened up a little. I just wish I had some water now. Even as Chris started to say that they didn't have any, he was still up on the mountain with their horses, Chiari rolled her eyes and gave a short laugh. She trotted over to the remnants of the camp and searched through the coolers that had been tossed around. She soon returned with a tin cup filled with it, along with several strips of jerky. Chris let his eyes scan the camp. Oh man, that looks great. Where'd you find that? Chiari gestured to the remains of the forest. Behind a couple of trees that didn't get mowed down, and no, I ain't getting you any. Go find your own. You can't miss 'em. Red igloo cooler and office-type water jug. As he chuckled and went to find it, she added, And the next time that we play with earth, wind, and fire, let's not leave the other air Terran to watch the horses, all right? He gave her a thumbs up over his shoulder, then called the others to come in and get water. When the others joined him, Roland laughed. What are we doing now? Having a chat beside the office water cooler? But his earlier elation and victory dance were gone. Chris looked back over the flat and winced. There were a lot of dead men lying there. Brennan produced a Kevlar vest he'd taken from one of the Cody guys and handed it to Chris. You don't know how lucky you are. Any one of those arrows could have found you. Chris shrugged. Give it to Chiari. Although I doubt any arrow will ever come close to her. She can pull them out of the air like nothing I ever seen. Brandon shoved the vest at him again. Put it on. I already found a smaller one for her. As Chris complied, Brandon added, So, boss, what's next? Adjusting the straps on the vest, Chris shot the former forest ranger a funny look. Up till now, the older man had had a very clear idea of how they should proceed. On the other hand, yes, Chris himself was not oblivious. We're going to talk, unless you guys think we want to wipe out the rest of them? When the others shook their heads, he quickly outlined his plan. Brandon gave a quick nod, then told Colby and Andreas to take up watches to the west, while Roland and J.R. would climb up high to watch their backs to the north. He even directed Chris to let Roland take Rusty with him, so that the border collie's great size would not add even more strangeness to their group. Then they found a couple of the injured men who were in good enough shape to walk. Chris winced when he saw them. Both of their clothes had been burnt away in spots, the skin underneath red and already developing painful bubbles. One man's shoulder was badly charred, and with just a glance, Chris knew he'd have a hard time recovering. Not without a myriad of modern medicine techniques that could no longer be performed. But he was still able to walk, and that's all they needed for now. With more roughness than necessary, Brandon helped him bring the two to the edge of the flat. He called the Terran from his core until his eyes shone with their red light and the scars were ridged and pulsing. I want to talk to your head honcho. I'm going to get safe passage for you guys and to get some help, and our guys will be able to go home with us. Both men stared down at their boots, afraid to encounter his terrifying face. Brandon shoved one of them forward. By the way that he breathed and moved, Chris thought he might have a whole slew of broken ribs as well as the arm he was cradling against his middle. He'd been pummeled by Andreas's rocks flying on Floyd's winds. "Call whoever is in charge and tell him we want to talk." The man grimaced, then stared up at Chris. "I'd never make a deal with a devil worshipper. We already killed 4 of you bastards, and we can take the rest." He pointed down at the longest tunnel, where the road before it was just barely visible. "Look down there. See that long rock standing by the edge of the canyon? That's one of your guys. He tried to pull half the mountain down on our man." He lifted his eyes to the heavens and breathed out a little prayer. "Our God prevailed over the forces of the devil." While Chris was taken aback by the venom in the man's voice, Brandon stepped closer. "You ambushed this group and tried to kill them. The ground down there looks like a pincushion, there are so many arrows. And then you say your God worked a great victory when a man died who was defending himself?" The man wiped blood from his nose and mouth, and never leaving his hunched posture, hissed, "We're coming after you next." Chris exchanged a wry look with Brandon, then said, "Whatever floats your boat, man." He put his hand on the man's back, and suddenly the air was filled with the renewed smell of burnt flesh. The man slunk down with a small cry and lay lifeless at their feet. Chris didn't even pause, and Brandon shoved the second man forward. As Chris gauged him, he raised his hands defensively, though. "Dude, stop. I'll do it. I got a wife and kids. They won't eat without me." He shook Brandon's grip off and stepped forward. He called his captain by name, Andy Ramirez, again and again, and each time an echo came back to them, distinct and clear. Grimly, Chris said to Brandon, "I'd say they can hear us." When they saw a figure step out of the cedars above the stark cliffs on the other side of the canyon, the Cody man bobbed his head. "That's him. He's in charge of this mess." On the western bluff, the one that had been torn to rubbled rifts by the rock Tarins, men moved amongst the cedars and pines. The archers there were readying themselves to attack, knocking arrows to bows and getting their aim. Down below, in the middle tunnel, the one they couldn't see from their vantage point, they could hear several voices speaking softly to each other. Brandon grimaced. "Ah, hell. I know him. He's a Catholic. His family went to the same church as mine." Chris did a double-take. He thought this was a Mormon thing, but he didn't have time for a lengthy discussion about it. Stepping forward, he shouted, "Andy, we got 22 of yours." Having yelled instructions from one ridge to another before, he knew to make each word distinct. "Even trade. Yours for ours." As Chris listened and watched for a reply, Brandon whispered to Chiari and Floyd, who joined them on the ridge of the limestone cliff. On the other side of the canyon, Andy Ramirez seemed to be conferring with someone. The other man didn't appear as if he'd spent the last few days camped out with the rest of the company. Well dressed and clean, he seemed more like he might be Andy's superior. Good. Maybe, just maybe, with input from the ones running this screwed-up mess, things wouldn't go sideways later. Brandon pushed Chiari forward. Her eyes were lit up just like Chris's, and with a gesture of her hand, pushed her Tarin out. A section of the cliff to the right crumpled in a cloud of thick dust. It fell silently at first, but as it tumbled down the side of the canyon, the sound of rocks and boulders striking the clay dirt below was loud in the stillness of the morning. With a clap on her shoulder, Brandon said, "Now, you and Floyd get up there. Leave Floyd to watch the horses and take Brady with you. If we don't come get you by noon, blow that irrigation ditch." She nodded curtly, then she and Floyd started running back to the draw where they had all come down. Brandon didn't waste any time watching them go. He raised his voice to carry across the canyon, shouting, "Andy, Parker, do you see that little chick?" Accompanying his words with exaggerated gestures, he continued, "She will take out the main ditch. You will lose all the water." He paused, then again pointed to the east. "Irrigation ditch. She will blow it in 2 hours." Chris stood back, thoroughly confused. What the hell was Brandon's game? The older man scoffed, however. "Damn it, kid. We crossed that ditch twice, and I pointed it out to you. That's what this whole thing is all about. The water to irrigate the fields from here halfway to Powell." He indicated the dead man at their feet. "I'm pretty sure this guy is from one of those Baptist sects. Andy over there is a Catholic. We've been told it's all about the Mormons, but no. This whole power grab is about the water. Water that comes from that lake and goes right under this mountain." He gestured at the wide open valley to the east, green and verdant in the morning sun. "No water, no fields. No fields, no food. No food, no people." He paused and gave a sickened chuckle. "No people, no power and control." Before Chris could wrap his mind around that, though, a voice from the other side answered. While the portly other man stood beside him, Andy Ramirez accompanied his garbled words with hand gestures, making their meaning clear. The Tarins in the tunnel would be allowed to leave. They sent their captive down to the road where he was to relay the message, but they needn't have. The Yellowstone Tarins had heard. With Chris, Brandon, and JR climbing low on the canyon side to provide whatever cover they could, the tunnel emptied out. It was slow going, especially the first bit, while the Tarins had to negotiate the fallen rocks and burnt brush that remained from the fight. The bikes they had arrived on were toast, lying around the area in broken and twisted pieces. Eventually, they reached the safety of the narrow flat. A tall, slim water Tarin kept his bow ready as he assisted the spirit Tarin. An air Tarin climbed up and over the low cliffs, a fire Tarin helping her as she reached for the easier ground above. A normie followed along closely, juggling his weapons as he struggled up the cliff. When Chris saw the next fire Tarin, he cursed inwardly. He knew the girl from when he'd trained with his Tarins back at the Madison camp. By the flickering blazes that lit her eyes, Summer Fuentes had burnt herself out. A normie was just behind, speaking soft instructions and looking out over the canyon as he guided her to safety. When they all gained the flat, Kristen sank to her knees, sobbing loudly. Since her Tarin was high, her eyes flickering purple under her marked brow, Chris caught the edges of her emotions. Intense relief mixed with passionate sorrow. Yet he gripped her and hustled her on. "No time, girl. There's no time for that now. We gotta go." Brandon pushed the others, telling them to get a move on, to run. Breathing the cold morning air, still tinged with the reek of burnt cedars and sage, they hurried back up the same steep draw they had come down. They stopped at the pile of weapons they had taken from the dead and injured men, and quickly found Kevlar vests for their 8 new buddies. As Chris and Brandon glanced back, keeping an eye on the other 2 companies, they saw men rushing to the bikes, mounting them, and bumping down the dirt road. Brandon grimaced. "I knew they couldn't leave it be." Breathing harshly, Chris responded, "Too much pride to let it go." He shook his head grimly, but he really couldn't blame them. There had been 8 of them, and they had taken out a whole company of the Cody men. When they gained the top of Rattlesnake Mountain, Roland and JR met them. Rusty and Killer had already come across the steep canyon side and cliffs and fallen in with Chris. Glad that they were okay, Chris bumped fists with Roland, then petted Rusty. "Where are Andreas and Cody?" Roland scanned their new arrivals. "They're going after the horses." He counted the newcomers. "Dang, just about every one of us is going to have to double up." Without taking time for greetings, he led the way to the north, where, presumably, the horses were waiting at some waterhole. Chris didn't immediately follow, though. He called Summer and took the silk scarf from around her neck. He doused it with the water they'd found in the blue plastic jugs down below and tied it over her eyes. She patted the cooling cloth, a relieved smile playing about her face. That's better, but I can't see anything. Chris looked at her incredulously, just a little bit glad she couldn't see his expression. It always amazed him what the different Tarins had figured out on their own and how much they didn't know. You have a firesight. Use it. You can't see the ground all over the brush, but you can see the horses and the people. It'll help. After a few more instructions, she figured it out and nodded her thanks at him. Her boyfriend walked ahead and guided her after the others, while Chris followed and steadied her if she stumbled over the sage or little rocks. They didn't have to walk far. Andreas, Colby, Lisa, and Floyd rode towards them, leading the other horses by the reins. They paired everyone up until only Yeller was left. However, there were 3 riders. With a shrug, Chris helped Pixie and her boyfriend, Luke, get aboard. Roland, riding double with one of the water Tarins, reined his horse closer. "What the hell, bro? You gonna run behind us?" Chris waved them on. "Go across the ridge tops and wait where we saw the cowboys and the cattle. I'll run down and get Chiara and Brady. I can ride double with one of them." Without a word, Roland slid off his horse, leaving his passenger to slide forward into the saddle. Indicating Chris, he growled, "Don't shine those eyes at me. I'm coming with you." The other Tarins gaped at the exchange until Brandon passed by them. "Don't mind those 2. They bicker worse than a friggin' married couple." Roland and Chris ran down the mountain, jumping over sagebrush and rocks, their weapons clattering against their legs as they rushed on. The dogs ran alongside, and Chris envied their sure-footed agility. Choosing the easiest route and not caring if they stayed hidden, they came across the ranch track that they had followed coming up this way. When they neared the flat, they saw Chiari and Brady standing beside their horses. Gasping with sharp breaths, Roland pulled the scarf from his neck as he ran. When they reached the others, they wasted no time in getting mounted. Just as Chris helped Chiari up behind him, she cried out, "Ride, Chris! There are a bunch of men on bikes. They're coming up from the river." Chris cursed. Twisting in the saddle, he saw the company coming, pedaling as fast as they could on the dirt track. However, they were on the other side of the wide, cemented irrigation canal. "Blow the ditch, girl." Clinging to his belt with one hand, she extended the other, and the concrete wall gave way. Water spilled out over the gravel road, pooled for a few moments, then picked up momentum as it rushed down the slope towards the river. With another gesture, Chiari opened another hole in the canal's side, and the water flowed even faster. Its clear blue changed colors to dirty gray as it began cutting a channel across the packed dirt alongside the duct. Their pursuers brought their bikes to a stop, shouting loud, vile curses at them. The little vehicles clattered as riders jumped off and readied their bows. When the arrows came at them, Chiari cried, "Stop, Chris!" He wheeled the horse around, and her hand came up over his shoulder, and the missiles dropped lifelessly down into the sagebrush at their feet. Trying to keep their mount steady, he swept his arm out. Fire flew from his fingertips as he swept his hand over their attackers. Arrows incinerated mid-flight, and behind him, Chiari grunted as she lost her hold on the metal heads. A gust blew across them, swaying them in the saddle and whipping the ends of his reins forward past the bay's face. Almost too late, Chris threw his flames into the gust, and their pursuers ducked low as the blazes strafed them. Behind him, he heard Brady exclaim with approval at the spectacle. Chris felt Brady's Tarin rise again, and, timing it perfectly now, he filled the wind Tarin's gust with more fire. Screaming arose from the dirt road on the other side of the canal, and the men threw themselves backwards into the draw just below. Others, trying to extinguish the flames clinging to them, staggered to the thick stream that now flowed past them and threw themselves into it. Guiding their mount right to the edge of the concrete embankment, he drew all the fire from those too injured to gain the safety of the water. A few still threw themselves into the canal and were swept away, but they didn't get far. When they reached Chiari's hole, The volume of water escaping its bounds swept them out into the pasture as well. Roland, riding behind Brady, laughed. "Girl, that is some expert-level shit. They only have about a third of their water." He raised his voice to shout at the ones who were still running the easy slope to the river. "Good luck growing anything this year." Chris grimaced, though. Even though their bikes were still here, most of the men had quickly put distance between themselves and the Tarins. Turning to Brady, he said, "Can you do your sound thing so the runners down there can hear me?" Brady grinned as he nodded, and his Tarin rose again. "Halfway to the river, boss." Shouting into Brady's flows, Chris called, "You started this show. You caught 4 of ours. You tortured and crippled them. We sent 10 more after them, and you killed 4 of those and threatened to kill the rest. We negotiated for safe passage, and you broke your word and sent this company to kill us." The running men below slowed as they heard him, and the few of the braver ones even stopped to turn and listen. He filled his hand with fire, letting a big ball of flame float above it. "I am the fire focus of the Yellowstone Circle. I swear to you, if you ever interfere with any Tarins movement again, I will light you up like a friggin' Christmas tree." Then he filled the air behind them with crackling flares, and the Cody men turned and ran again. However, several, those who were far enough away not to be threatened by the roaring blast, made filthy gestures at him before following the others. Roland laughed after them, explaining, "Whooped him again, Josie," and he and Brady did a double fist bump. Chiari tugged at Chris's belt, though, and indicated the bikes. Burnt and broken now, the men had abandoned them. "Get me closer, Chris, and I'll make sure they can't use them again." Chris shook his head as he turned his horse to the north. "Leave 'em, girl. Finding parts for that mess will keep them busy for a while. And it's better for us if they use them most of the time. They'll be faster on the roads, but they also can't leave the pavement. Not like our horses. With them, we can go anywhere." This was a story from the Wyoming Tarin Rising series, and we want to thank you sincerely for listening. Please, press that like button now, since that'll help the vid and the story get recommended for others. Besides, nothing makes a person's day more than seeing those likes. This part was called Wyoming Tarins Rising, Winning Stupid Prizes. It was narrated, and ever so slightly edited, by Josh C. Williams and written by Ashakery Dart. It is copyrighted for May 11th, 2026. Hopefully we'll have another one ready for you soon, so be sure to subscribe and check back for updates.